Imagine that somebody put 4 cards in front of you and you knew that each card had a letter on one side and a number on the other. And they asked you to test a rule. The rule is that every card that has a D on one side should have a 3 on the other side. Now, how many of these cards would you need to turn over to find out if that card followed the rule? Would you need to turn over the D? Would you need to turn over the K? Would you need to turn over the 3? Or would you need to turn over the 7? You might need to turn over more than one, you might need to turn them all over, but what's the fewest number of cards you could turn over to test that rule? Now, before I tell you the answer, I'm going to ask you another question in a slightly different venue. Let's say you work in a bar, and you don't want your bar to lose your liquor license, which means you have to make sure that you are enforcing the rule. If the drink is alcoholic, then the drinker must be at least 21. Now, how many of these people do I need to check on? Either card them if I don't know their age, or check to see what they're drinking if I do know their age. This first guy is drinking a Texas Bock from Corpus Christi's own Lazy Beach Brewing Company. An excellent choice, but I don't know how old he is. Do I need to card him? The second woman is drinking a Coke, no alcohol in it, I know that, but I don't know how old she is. Do I need to card her? The third guy I know is 40, but I'm not really sure what's in that stein he's drinking. Do I need to check that drink to see if it's alcoholic? And the last woman is 19 years old. I know she's 19, I know she's underage, but I don't know what's in that daiquiri, if anything. It may be non-alcoholic, but it might have alcohol in it. Do I need to check that daiquiri to find out if she's violating the rule? This second problem probably seemed a lot simpler, a lot more intuitive than the first one. But logically, they're the same problem. In logic, you'll test a rule like, if P is true, then Q is true. So in the first example, I do need to turn over the D card, because if there's any other number on the back of that D, then that card has violated the rule. For the same reason, I need to card the young man who's drinking the Lazy Beach beer. Logically, this if P then Q, P is true, therefore I assume Q is true. This is called modus tollens. This is a valid argument. In the second situation, the card with a K on it, it doesn't really matter what number's on the other side of that card, because being a K, the rule about a D on one side and a 3 on the other does not apply to it. Similarly, the woman who's drinking a Coke, it doesn't matter how old she is because she's not drinking something alcoholic, so the rule doesn't apply to her. So if I assumed it did, that would be denying the antecedent logically, and this is a logical fallacy. If P, then Q is the rule, and P is not the case, therefore I assume Q is not the case, but there could be other reasons why Q is the case. Similarly, it doesn't really matter what's on the other side of the card with a 3, because the rule is if there's a D on one side, there should be a 3 on the other side, not if there's a 3 on one side, there should be a D on the other side. And for the same reason, the guy drinking from a pewter stein is 40 years old, so it doesn't really matter what's in the stein. So the logical rule, if P then Q, if I affirm that Q is the case and I assume that P is the case, I'm affirming the consequent, and this is an invalid argument, another logical fallacy. There could be other reasons why Q happened without P causing it. And in the last case, I do have to turn over that 7, because if there's a D on the other side, then that card violates the rule. For the same reason, I do need to check and see what's in the woman's daiquiri, knowing that she's 19 years old, not old enough to have alcohol, so I need to make sure she's not violating the rule. And the rule there, if P then Q, I deny the consequent. If P necessarily leads to Q and Q didn't happen, then I can be relatively sure P didn't happen. This is a valid argument. It's called modus tollens. Now, the second example, the second problem, the problem in the bar, was probably very intuitive, very easy. Your intuitive cognition automatically comes up with an answer before you really have to stop and think about it reflectively. But the first problem, the one with the cards on one side and the numbers on the other, probably did take a lot of reflective thinking. This type of problem is called the Wason selection test. It was originally done by Peter Wason back in the 1960s with the cards on one side and the numbers on the other, and it was later adapted by the psychologists Leda Cosmides and John Tooby to argue that the human mind has developed a lot more cognitive machinery for keeping track of people and making sure people are following rules. That way we have to be certain that we're not being cheated, that other people aren't violating the rules and getting away with something that might be detrimental to us. As social animals, we developed a lot more cognitive machinery specifically focused on human interaction. But the human mind isn't a logical processing device like a computer, so it's not as well adapted to doing something more abstract like this that doesn't necessarily involve people breaking rules. But the reason I bring this up is because your brain is able to do a lot of logic in a certain situation. It has to take in certain premises and come to a conclusion about what rules need to be followed and how to implement those rules. And it does it before we really have to stop and think about it in some cases, but not in others. In all this logical problem solving, we have a premise and a conclusion. And premises and conclusions are integral parts of arguments. If we want to make an argument, we can't just have a conclusion. If I just say that here's the way things ought to be and that's the end of it, that's just my opinion. Well, that's great, but it's just an opinion, it's not an argument. And of course we have people all over the place telling us what they think and not really supporting that with anything. So how much do we really want to stop and devote attention to somebody just spouting off conclusion after conclusion? Well, when you write an essay, you don't want it to be just a series of conclusions either. That conclusion is the end of an argument, and the argument is composed of one conclusion, but a lot of premises that lead to that conclusion. And whether or not certain premises lead to certain conclusions is something we can study by the structure of the argument. It doesn't just depend on what the conclusion is. So we can define an argument as the assertion of a conclusion based on logical premises and supported by evidence. And the premise is a proposition that's used as evidence in an argument. The conclusion is the logical result of the relationship between the premises. The conclusions serve as the thesis of an argument, the thesis of your paper. And a syllogism is one of those if P then Q formulas, the simplest sequence of logical premises and conclusions. And this type of formula, this way of simplifying an argument into three components, at least three components, in this syllogism, goes back to the Greek philosopher Aristotle, writing nearly 2,400 years ago. We typically don't bother to enunciate the rules that we use when we make basic arguments. For example, if I said to you, you should take an umbrella because it's raining outside, I presume that you would agree with the premise, if it's raining outside, you should take an umbrella. If you already agree with that premise, then I only need to inform you that the second premise is true, that it is raining outside. You might not already know that. This unstated rule that connects the reason with the conclusion is called a warrant. Often our arguments are not accepted not because of the stated reasons or not because someone disputes the reasons we state, but because they don't share the same warrant. For example, if I said, you should take an umbrella because it's raining outside, you might agree with the stated reason that it's raining outside, but you might disagree with my rule that going out in the rain requires an umbrella. After all, it's always windy here next to the bay, and the wind can turn your umbrella inside out, so you might be better off with a raincoat. If we don't share the same warrant, we might look at the same facts, the same stated reason, but then come to different conclusions. So if you offer your umbrella to your roommate, and she doesn't accept that offer, don't take it as a personal insult. It doesn't mean that she's disputing the stated premise. It doesn't mean that she doesn't believe you. It just means that there's a warrant at work in her reasoning that is different than yours. In this case, she's thinking about an alternative way to keep the rain off. So you both agree on the premise that it's going to rain. You both agree on the premises that she will have to go outside into the rain and that she doesn't want to get wet. So it won't do any good to dispute those warrants. And you wouldn't make any progress by saying, take my umbrella unless you just want to get wet because it's going to rain. The unshared warrant is that an umbrella will keep her dry in the particular environment she has to navigate. If the wind is blowing and the rain is horizontal, which it tends to do here on the island, and it's probably going to blow your umbrella inside out, so you're still going to get wet. So her alternative warrant leads to an alternative conclusion, even though you both share many of the same premises. Okay, let's take another example. Let's return to our friend who we suppose is of legal drinking age. This time he's enjoying a commission IPA from Lorelei Brewing Company here in Corpus Christi. He must like craft beer. And he no doubt has good reasons for that choice. That doesn't mean everyone else is going to share his reasons, and as a result, not everyone is going to share that choice. When we don't share conclusions, and we don't really know the warrants that other people are using to come to different conclusions, we tend to make inferences about what their reasons might be. Sometimes there are obvious reasons, but sometimes we make the wrong inferences. This may be because we have different warrants for our warrants, reasons for our reasons. If you've ever made a decision that has offended someone else or provoked an unusually negative response from someone else, you may be left wondering what is so wrong with your conclusion. But in these cases, it might not be your conclusion so much as what they think your reasons for that conclusion are. In this case, if you like craft beer, someone might assume, oh, well, you think you're better than the rest of us. You think you're too good to drink what the rest of us drink. When in reality, you actually want to support local businesses, or you just like the different flavors of craft beer. You might be a little bit bored with American adjunct lager, the kind of thing you get in the mass market beers. But you want to make your warrants explicit in order to avoid unnecessary divisions. So many arguments between people, especially between groups of people, are based on the beliefs that one group thinks the other group has. And too often we put ourselves and other people into identity groups based on conclusions and presume warrants behind those conclusions. And that really has more to do with the groups than it does with the arguments. We're going to devote a lot of time to analyzing how that process works in the end of the semester. But right now, let's just look at how arguments are structured with conclusions following from stated and unstated premises. Think of your argument like a tree. The above ground part, the conclusion and all the consequences that flow from it, that's the part of the tree that's above ground. But your premises are the roots. And some of those roots you can see. But there are many more at work in your argument than you realize. Our conclusions depend on many, many more premises than we can possibly be aware of, and more than we could ever completely list out. The best we can do is try to figure out what premises aren't shared with other people. And the syllogism helps us to isolate and examine the premises that we don't share, rather than wasting too much time stating the obvious, all the premises that we share with everyone else. Identifying the premises that we don't share helps us isolate the ones that may be faulty and to decide if all these premises actually belong in this argument. That's two steps. We have to decide if all of the premises are true, but we also have to decide if the argument is valid. First of all, many arguments depend on faulty warrants, and sometimes those warrants are buried and the person making the argument doesn't realize they're depending on them. For example, if someone says Harry Potter novels are set in England, and England is a real place, so Harry Potter must be real. The two stated premises are true, and the person making this argument might think, well, if my premises are true, if my reasons are true, then my conclusion must be true, right? But there's a missing premise here, and that is that if anything in a novel is real, then everything in that novel is real. And clearly that's not a very accurate premise. Identifying premises also helps us to figure out which ones need to be questioned. So if someone assumes that Bill is good at basketball because he's tall, well, premise 1 is all tall people are good at basketball, and premise 2 is Bill is tall, so the conclusion that flows from that is Bill is good at basketball. And while some of the best basketball players are usually very tall, we can't assume that all tall people are good at basketball. We would question that first premise, specifically the first word. All tall people are good at basketball. We might say many tall people are good at basketball, but not all tall people are good at basketball. So in this case, the mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio, is nearly 6'6", but that doesn't necessarily mean he's spent much of his life focusing on learning how to play basketball. He might be a good mayor, but might be terrible at basketball. Now within this syllogism, the conclusion is logically valid. That doesn't mean it's true. What valid means is that if all the premises are true, then the conclusion will be true. But in this case, we dispute the truth value of the first premise. Now, if we didn't dispute that truth value, if it was, hypothetically, if it was true that all tall people were good at basketball and that Bill is tall, then we could conclude that Bill is good at basketball. But in this case, even though it's a valid argument, it's an untrue premise. So the conclusion is going to be untrue. An invalid argument would be an argument in which the conclusion could be untrue even if all the stated premises were true. In this case, if I said that all birds lay eggs and that platypuses lay eggs, and I concluded from those two premises that platypuses are birds, or conversely, if I put forward the premise that all mammals have fur, the second premise that platypuses had fur, and I concluded from that that platypuses are mammals, I would be wrong in both cases. Even though the premises are true in both of those examples, the conclusions are wrong because platypuses are neither birds nor mammals. This is that same affirming the consequent argument that we looked at earlier. So again, the difference between a valid and invalid argument is that an argument is valid if the premises necessarily lead to a single conclusion. If the premises are true, the conclusion will have to be true. But validity is not the same as truth. A valid conclusion will only be true if the premises are true. So why would we care about an argument's validity if even a valid argument could be false? Well, we're always going to have to deal with uncertainty. Any premise we imagine might be true as far as every test we've put it through in the past, but there still might be something wrong with it. Remember how falsification works. We can never totally prove something universally true. Everything we think we know, the best we can do is try to falsify it, and if it passes that test, if we're unable to falsify it, then we can be very confident that it's probably mostly true, as opposed to something that is defended by confirmation bias or other kinds of motivated reasoning, in which we can't really assume that it's been very well tested. But even the things that we test, they might pass the falsification test time after time after time, but that doesn't mean that they will always pass. There may be a new set of facts, an anomaly that we haven't found yet. There are things out there that we don't know that we don't know. A common term for this is a black swan. So if I take the argument that all swans are white, and I see a bird flying through the mist, and I can tell that the bird is black, and I'm trying to figure out if it's a swan or not, and I say to myself, well, all swans are white, but that bird is black, so that bird must not be a swan. That is a valid argument, and it uses premises that were thought to be true for most of human history. All across the Northern Hemisphere, in Europe, in Asia, in North Africa, Northern South America, and all across North America, there are swans everywhere, and they're all white. So that led people to just assume from inductive reasoning that one of the characteristics of being a swan is being white. It was only when explorers reached Australia that they found the first examples of black swans. But that discovery required them to rethink everything they thought about swans. So that premise that had been true in all of human experience in the Northern Hemisphere suddenly had to be rethought once black swans were discovered in Australia. So we might add certain qualifications, which means add new premises, and say as certainly as we can, premise 1, all swans in the Northern Hemisphere are white, but premise 2, Australian swans are black, and premise 3, the bird that I see in front of me is black, and premise 4, we are presently not in Australia but in the Northern Hemisphere, and premise 5, we have no reason to assume that anyone has imported a black swan to this area from Australia, so we may come to the conclusion that this bird must not be a swan. We're a lot closer to a certain argument than we were before. We have a valid argument, and we have, as far as we know, true premises, but of course nobody talks like this. And Aristotle was very much aware of this. Aristotle, who's the one who first broke down arguments into premises and conclusions, into syllogisms, also realized that they can't stay there. Ancient Athens, where he lived, was a place where everyone discussed philosophy, they discussed politics, they discussed history, they founded the modern sciences, but they did it through talking to each other. People didn't carry around notebooks ready to map out these syllogisms. Aristotle was very aware that we had to be able to translate our syllogisms back into comprehensible language if anyone was ever going to accept them. And when a syllogism is translated back into real life and real language, we call it an enthymeme. An enthymeme, according to Aristotle in his book, The Rhetoric, an enthymeme is a syllogism dealing with practical subjects. We can think of it as a shortened syllogism that has one premise and it has the conclusion, but it also allows us to find the second premise. For example, if I say that vegetables are healthier than junk food because they have more fiber and fewer simple carbohydrates, I'm only giving you one premise and one conclusion, but you can probably see what the other premise is, the unstated warrant that is necessary to connect that reason to that claim. That is, that fiber is healthier than simple carbohydrates. So every enthymeme, even if it doesn't state the warrant, it's going to necessarily have that warrant to connect the claim to the reason. So the enthymeme is going to contain three basic components. It's going to have that claim stated, and that claim is what in a syllogism would be the conclusion. And it's going to have one premise, and we're going to call that the reason, but it's also going to imply a particular warrant. And that warrant is going to be the link that connects the reason and the claim. And if that warrant is a fallacy, then it doesn't matter whether or not the reason is true or not. So as it's written, the sentence of an enthymeme is going to have two independent clauses. An independent clause is one with a subject, verb, and maybe an object. It's going to have one independent clause about the claim, and it's going to have one independent clause about the reason. It's going to have a conjunction between these two clauses, like because or therefore, that show connection. And it's going to have a shared subject term that appears in both the assertion and the reason. Now I'll give you an example of this. If I said that college students should get free flu vaccines, that's a claim. But it's got two components here for our purposes. The subject of the clause is college students, and the word term here logically may mean an entire phrase, but this first independent clause has two components that we want to keep track of. The subject, which is college students, and what it is we're arguing about them. In this case, that they should get free flu vaccines. So I have term A and term B. Now that's just the claim. My reason, signaled by the word because, is that they, the college students, the same subject from the first clause, are most likely to transmit the virus to new populations. Now we all know little children are very likely to get sick and go to school and spread a virus or other pathogen to all their friends and maybe their teachers, and then those friends go home and infect their parents, and their parents go to work and infect people. But if you think about the way college students travel, you go home to a different part of the state, maybe a different part of the country, maybe even another country, and then you pick up a virus from a friend or family member there, then you travel back to the university, and then you're in the same sort of close quarters in a classroom that children or high school students would be, except everyone in that classroom is bringing viruses from much further away. And then you transmit them to each other, and then someone else travels back home and they take that virus with them. And so the virus travels much faster with college students. Now that's my reason. That part about college students being most likely to transmit the virus, that's the third term, term C. And so I put the whole thing together like this. I have college students in both clauses. They're listed in the claim and they're listed in the reason. So college students should get free flu vaccines because they are the most likely to transmit the virus to new populations. Now, the reason I've color-coded it this way is because even though I've got two clauses with two halves each, I've only got three terms. It's very important that I have a shared term in both the claim and the reason, because I'm going to take that shared term out. I'm going to take out the college students there, because in order to find the warrant, I need to be able to take out that shared term and see what I'm left with. So in this case, to find your warrant, you cross out your shared term, replace them with general words such as something or someone, replace the because or therefore with if at the beginning of the reason. And the second and the third term, when put together, will form the unstated warrant. So in this case, I take out the reference to college students and I just say if someone is likely to transmit the flu virus to new populations, then he or she should get free flu vaccines. And I need to separate it out because somebody might agree that college students are indeed the most likely to transmit a flu virus from one population to another, but that might not be enough for them to say that they should get free flu vaccines. So we would need to get someone to agree not only that college students are the most likely to transmit a flu virus from one population to another, but we would also need to get them to agree to the premise that whoever was most likely to transmit a flu virus across a greater distance between different populations would need to have extra precautions, would need to have easier access to a flu vaccine. So there are a lot of reasons why somebody might disagree with that warrant. They might say that, well, if we have limited funds, then we may not be able to give free flu vaccines to anybody, whether or not they're susceptible, whether or not they carry the virus across long distances to different populations. They might be focused on a warrant about how much a person is endangered by a flu virus. They might be focused on young children and older people who might suffer more from the illness, whereas college students are relatively healthy, they have relatively robust immune systems, so they can handle the effects of the flu. It's very aggravating, but it's not life and death risk, although it might be a life and death risk for very young children or very old people who have weaker immune systems. So someone might have a warrant that's focused on the vulnerability of the population rather than how likely that population is to move between other populations. But once we isolate that warrant, then we know what to do next. We know what questions to ask next if we're analyzing the rhetoric of another argument. If we're reading an article and we know that we disagree with the conclusion, but it's not enough just to disagree with the conclusion and come up with our own reasons. We first have to understand what the premises are that are listed out by that argument. That means the stated premises, but also the unstated warrants. We have to be able to find those warrants so that we can challenge them on their own terms, rather than throwing in new premises of our own, which may or may not be relevant. But also this helps us know what to do next when we're writing our own essays. So if I want to write an essay arguing that college students should get free flu vaccines, I don't want to just keep repeating that claim over and over again. Once you make the claim, it's there. You don't have to say it 3 or 4 different ways. I want to, first of all, give my stated reason when I want to argue that college students are the most likely to transmit the virus across populations. I'll state that reason and then I'll back it up with evidence. In this case, I might want to check a peer-reviewed epidemiology journal that would have the numbers I needed to support that reason, because the reason itself is also a claim. Every premise is a claim that might be disputed and that needs to be supported. So the facts in this case might be the numbers of college students and how quickly they enable the transmission of a flu virus from one side of the country to another. But even if I have all sorts of evidence proving my reason, and that reason being the one that I think most supports my claim, I still have to identify the warrant that connects that reason to the claim so that I can see what other objections might be raised to what I'm saying. In this case, somebody might challenge my warrant by saying, well, why should it be free? Why can't we just encourage college students to get flu vaccines without making it free for them? Well, that's another argument I'll have to make. I'll have to support that claim. I might say that, well, they're much more likely to get it if it's free than they would be if it cost money. But then that raises practical issues, like where is this money going to come from? Is it going to come out of tuition? Is it going to come from taxpayer subsidies? And will that even work? Will making it free have any more effect? Is that actually going to make people more likely to get the vaccine, or isn't it? Is there any data you can show that will support the claim that making something free makes it more popular? These are questions that I would need to answer at some point in my essay. But I wouldn't necessarily realize that I needed to answer those questions until I make my warrant explicit and then see what other objections might be thrown at it. So the syllogism is there so that we can look at the structure of our argument, so that it's not some intangible mystery. And very importantly, so that we don't just end up restating our claims over and over again, or making tangential claims that really need to be supported in and of themselves and may distract from the original claim. If I make one claim and then another claim and then another claim and then another claim, and those claims aren't tied together, well, then I'm just throwing out lots of opinions. I'm not actually making an argument. A syllogism will help you figure out if you have an argument and how it's structured. It'll help you figure out not only what your conclusion is and how to make that specific, but also to figure out what your premises are. Your stated premises, but also your unstated premises, your warrants. Then once you know what your main reason and your main claim are, you can put them together into an enthymeme, use that to find the warrant, find out if the logic connecting the premises to the claim is valid or invalid, and then begin to support those claims with evidence from the best sources you can find.